on last night's message of inclusion and authenticity and matterness, that is making sure we do everything possible to count everybody in our community and to make sure each feels like he or she or they matters. This is an opportunity to draw on a sermon of old, namely Yom Kippur, sermon about Hachnasat Orchim and the spirit of welcoming. It's an opportunity to draw on a recent recap of that sermon in our Sfirat HaOmer project, when I spoke further about Hachnasat Orchim and the practice of welcoming and inclusion. And last night after services, we were talking about a number of matters, and it came to my attention that this particular Shabbat is devoted to members in our community who identify as Jews of color. It is also true that there have been a flurry of articles out there in the cybersphere about our Jews of color community and the extent to which we are, in fact, as inclusive as we should be. And so all that comes together in what amounts to be much like a Yom Kippur sermon. So sit back, and I hope that we can not only think deeply about the ideas in this sermon, but that we can actually talk about not only the power of inclusion, but the practice of it and how to make sure that we improve in any ways that we have yet to improve in. So it's in that spirit that I remind some of you and tell some of you that last night we began a conversation about the power of the wilderness as a place that invites honesty and humility, a place that breaks down our presuppositions and assumptions about who we are and who we are not, a place that avails us wide opportunity to grow, to improve, to rise up to our better selves. Our key text here also juxtaposes the tent of meeting with the midbar, with the desert, and calls us to a certain level of responsibility. That is, while we are collectively making our way through the wilderness of our becoming, while we are becoming more honest with ourselves, while we are seeking to become our better selves, we must make sure to count all in our tent of meeting, whether real or virtual. All who are engaged in spiritual growth themselves, to make sure that every one of us is properly counted, to make sure every one of us matters, to make sure we've done everything to ensure that everyone who does matter actually feels like they matter in our midst. And so I repeat our big questions from last night. Given this COVID chaos, which often feels like a desert of disconnection and isolation and loneliness and uncertainty in its own right, how can our Parshat HaShavua, how can our study and reflection today bring us a little inspiration as we find our way? What is our call to action, Chevre? And what must we do to stay connected? And what must we do to ensure all are counted and all feel connected? So we also discussed last night this practice of census, of accounting for the matterness of all. We discussed this sacred practice as key to our in-reach efforts, as key in our capacity to care for others. Our community is only as strong as our ability to connect with those who feel disconnected, with those who feel marginalized, with those who don't always feel adequately counted or included. So while I am indeed proud of our progress thus far as we grind through this pandemic, especially with respect to our Chesed team, I know we have yet a long way to go. Just take, for example, this flurry of recent articles I spoke of regarding deep concern over various studies that support the fact that Jews of color and their families have been historically undercounted and underserved by the Jewish community. What are the implications of this? For important guidance on this question, I turn to the wisdom of Yavila McCoy, CEO of Dimensions, Inc., which works with the Jewish community on matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I wholly recommend Ms. McCoy's article, Dancing Between the Light and Shadow, Increasing Awareness, the Impact of COVID-19 Disparities on Jews of Color. You can find it on the internet. Here, Ms. McCoy tells a powerful story about her own personal pandemic experience. When the pandemic hit this country and our national shutdown began, I lost my previously healthy mother to undetermined causes in a rural North Carolina hospital. In late March, I flew on an empty plane to arrange a Jewish burial for her within 24 hours. I arrived to an Orthodox Jewish community that was spinning with the impact of navigating rising deaths among them while being prohibited by state-mandated restrictions from observing usual Jewish rituals for burial. I also arrived at a hospital in the Black Southern community where my mother lived and encountered doctors and nurses working without protective gear, without the capacity for testing patients, and without any expectations that resources would be coming their way anytime soon. This ongoing challenge is similar to many others in this pandemic, and in particular, how Jews of color are living through it, Ms. McCoy reports. And these ongoing challenges are intense. People living in packed dwellings with multiple generations, some of whom are sick. People worried about family members facing life and death situations amidst a mass incarceration. People risking health and safety in essential roles without proper government support, and worries that joblessness means homelessness. People navigating a racialized system that devalues a person of color beyond the service one can provide to a white person. Yavila McCoy's narrative and ensuing analysis about Jews of color hits hardest because it's not that these challenges suddenly popped out of the pandemic-laden blue. These challenges were just and have been made worse by the COVID chaos. She speaks of increased vulnerability, not only to a lethal virus, but fundamentally inequitable systems that have been killing people in Black and brown bodies for centuries. She speaks that within our country, we are witnessing daily how systems that have not changed in regard to racial injustice, police brutality, criminal justice reform, voting rights and suppression, immigration justice, economic justice, LGBTQIA plus and human rights, environmental conditions, healthcare, government corruption, education, common sense gun laws, the list goes on. All of these issues make people of color in our country more vulnerable, not less. So, while this pandemic, in a sense, accidentally avails us the opportunity to build back better our synagogues, our schools, and our summer camps, Chavre, what will we do in our community to build back better our relationship with those who identify as Jews of color? Ms. McCoy and other Jews of color wonder. How will the narratives that Jewish leaders are proximate and not proximate to impact their ability to address how Jews of color, as a historically vulnerable population among Jews, will make it through this pandemic without being made more vulnerable within Jewish systems and within the country's navigation of COVID responsiveness? Answering this question must be a critical responsibility going forward if we are to get truly proximate in our work of building back better. You may remember that we began this conversation back on Yom Kippur. And as I mentioned, I followed up upon it as part of our Sfirat HaOmer project. In both contexts, I focus on the power of Hachnasat Orchim, the spirit and practice of welcoming and inclusion. As a Reform movement, we recognize a very important truth, so beautifully captured here. Jewish diversity in all its hues is no longer a wave. It is the ocean of Jewish life. At Emanuel Congregation, we keep the doors of Hachnasat Orchim open always. Whether at 5959 North Sheridan or here in cyberspace. Our village, our tent of meeting, whether in physical or in virtual form, welcomes you no matter how you identify as a Jew, no matter what your engagement in Jewish life. Our spirit of welcome flows from a belief in audacious hospitality, a transformative spiritual practice rooted in the belief that we will be stronger and more vibrant as a Jewish community when we fully welcome and incorporate the diversity that is this precious reality of modern Jewish life and the pursuit of authentic Jewish identity. Emanuel Congregation is a diverse congregation. We are proud to say that our diversity reflects the diversity of Chicago. But we've also learned that diversity is not the same as inclusion. In the words of activist Vernee Myers, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Chevre, if we want to tout diversity, we must actively choreograph the inclusive embrace of our diverse community and our diverse perspectives. We must walk toward discomfort, as Ms. Myers coaches, toward authentic relationships, deeper, closer connections, close enough to see the whole person. It's not about perfection, Ms. Myers says. It's about connection. It's about seeking people who can see our humanity. It's about fashioning compassionate understanding that flows forth from friendship with people who are different from us. This, chevre, is Hachnasat Orchim. This is how we practice inclusion. Consider this piece of Kabbalah. You and I and everyone come from the Adam Kadmon, the primordial person, God's original intention for humanity, celestial, androgynous, and the size of the entire universe. But then we learned that Adam Kadmon sinned, and God reduced the primordial person to what we learn in the folklore as a flesh and blood, bifurcated moral creature, the same creature we are now. What this means is that every human soul is but a fragment of the collective soul that is Adam Kadmon, which means that every human soul comes from the goof, comes from the body of the very first person. And what this means spiritually is that we all come from the same soulful origin. no matter how different we seem to manifest. And when we become aware of this, I borrow from Vernay Meyer's Midrash, something really powerful happens. Something really beautiful happens. We start to realize that those we see as different, they are us. That they are a part of us. That they are us in our own families. And when this understanding occurs, we cease to be bystanders and we become actors and we become advocates and we become allies. What a beautiful vision for Hachnasat Orchim. What a beautiful vision for the spirit of welcome. What a beautiful vision for building back better a truly inclusive community. So what then, Chevre, is the call to action? Ultimately, our journey through this pandemic, this new wilderness, must teach us about the power of Hachnasat Orchim. Our tent of meeting, whether physical or virtual, must be welcoming, and it must be inclusive. Hachnasat Orchim must flow from the disciplined practice of counting every single person as made in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim, full of intrinsic worth, and someone who truly matters always. If our journey in the Midbar is about authentic and genuine living, so is this pandemic. Today, just like in ages ago in the desert, Hachnasat Orchim is about growing and becoming who we are, who we can be at every stage of our lives, and especially in relationship to one another. We must encourage the creation of a culture of welcoming and acceptance and celebration and respect within our Jewish community, one that is mindfully inclusive of Jews of color, of Jews who identify as LGBTQIA+, of Jews by choice, of Jews living with different abilities, of intermarried couples. And this inclusion and welcome and spirit must extend to their families as well, our families. And Hachnasat Orchim means to me something very important and very personal. Because as I convey this message to you, as I see my face in the screen in front of me, I see a white, heterosexual, cisgender human being that must do his part to check whatever assumptions and biases that may preclude me, obviously or subtly, from being as welcoming and as inclusive as I think I am. And while I can only be truly responsible for myself, I do encourage you to embrace the same responsibility for yourselves. And finally, Hachnasat Orchim, audacious hospitality, must be at the root of our community, transforming it into a collective force for good that continuously builds on the relationality and the justice and the kindness and the matterness and the spirituality of welcome. And with that, I wish you Shabbat Shalom.